Howdy, all of you delicious people. I'm here today to review Reservoir Dogs. So, going into this movie, it's kind of an interesting film because we have a heist film where they don't actually show the heist. The most intriguing thing about a heist film, they didn't bother to show. So I just thought that was kind of like a one of a kind thing where it's like, man, they got on to do so much story and so many like interesting things that are being like put into this film, but then they forgot like to do the most important part, that of course people would love to see, or see little snippets or see little things of, and then them having to just explain it later just kind of feels weird. But the thing I like about this is we kind of have a number of kind of random people all put together and they don't know one another. Kind of like Baby Driver, where we of course have the young kid who is to be the like consistent person that's kind of working with Kevin Spacey's character, and we just kind of have a number of random people who are picked through a number of different jobs that are all kind of smashed together. And so, like, this is kind of like that, where we of course have these people that may or may not be familiar uh, with Joe, the guy who's orchestrating all this together, but it may seem that they may just be uh, uh, like they all know what they're doing because they've done this so many times, possibly before. So so going into this film currently on HBO Max, if I didn't say that already, we have these characters who get picked to, of course, be these certain barrage of colors: orange, white, blonde, pink. And of course, we have somebody that has to gripe about being like the pink color. It's like, why do I have to be freaking pink? Like, why can't I just be purple? Or why can't you just be white? Or why can't you just be. Why do I have to be brown? And so on and so forth. And we not only get just like the one thing that kind of bugs me throughout this film, it seems that we have kind of two characters that aren't relevant at all in this film. We just kind of have two characters that you don't really see throughout a big, massive amount of this film. And like you could probably say that there were certain characters that were probably just kind of written in for the film, like probably Quentin had written himself into this movie. Um, but like, why not? Like, why not just have fun with these kind of characters? And like, we always have it where Quentin is always somehow involved in a movie. Like he always is in his own film at some point where he kind of has this small little thing, and then he kind of walks off. And so I always kind of enjoy that. Like we can always tell when it's a Quentin Tarantino movie because he'll actually be in it. Like I kind of like that. It's kind of like Peter Jackson in the Lord of the Rings, where you would kind of consistently every once in a while see him in the Hobbit or the Lord of the Rings, kind of in the background of somewhere, where obviously you could see him. So, anyways, so the grading of this movie, I would have to go on and like I would have to say that this is a I would have to say that this is a solid okay movie. Like to me, like this movie is like so heavily on the dialogue. Because of course they don't actually have the heist part. So it's kind of like the build up to that and the aftermath of it. And I'm a very visual person, and so like immediately when we have a movie where there's like my interest can only go so far, because of course like it really just ties on to the fact that like okay, like give me a kind of break between all of this massive dialogue and give me this big huge action sequence where there isn't as much dialogue, and there never was that. So this movie is like too dialogue heavy, too uh, too talky heavy. A lot of guys who all have a lot of stories to tell, and I'm just like, well, yeah, but like we're missing like the kind of the payout moment, and so immediately I kind of just like groan about that for whatever goofy reason. But I kind of like the fact that also this is to be that one of a kind movie where they're kind of doing everything else but like the big scene that you would see in every heist film. Um, Plus, I just like how like small like this movie is. How it's like we don't have this big, huge, massive showcasing. Most of this stuff all takes place with mostly 2 to 3 guys in one scene together for the most point of this film. So, with that said, let's just go into that double five time territory. Let's just go into this thing that is ultimately to be called spoiler time. It's spoiler time. It's about that time we can do spoil this movie. So, I would say it's a solid, good film, like, or a solid uh like I would say it's a solid okay film going into like the good territory, but just man, like I'm not much of a heist person. I'm not much of a like heavily dialogued thing, but like for those of you that possibly like stuff like Grand Theft Auto and stuff like that, like you can get really intrigued about this film, or maybe people who are to like Godfather and stuff like that. You could go on and find this intriguing. So, with that said, let's just go into spoilers. So, I'm going to kind of jump around and not do it perfectly like the film. So, if I'm not doing it perfect, then it is what it is. But, anyways, so in the very beginning of this film, to which that I want to go into, we have a number of these guys that are all around this table, and so they're kind of all eating this meal, and so they're all kind of discussing Madonna. Of course, Mr. Brown's character is going on and talking about the Like a Virgin song, where they're trying to figure out like what is what is the meaning of that song? What does it actually mean? And some of them are kind of saying that like yeah, she's never been with somebody before, or maybe she's been through too many guys that kind of all hurt her, and so now she wants to go on and like feel like a sense of renewal and this and that. And so like all these guys have this idea of what the song is about. And so Quentin is going on and mentioning it's like, well, uh, Mr. Brown is mentioning that, well, what I think that that song is actually to represent is pain. That really this girl has probably went through all kinds of men, but all of a sudden we have the one guy that is to just be like so good at what he does to this woman that she is to feel this sense of renewal, this pain that is to remind her of her very first time, because she has never felt this kind of sensation in such a long time with being with somebody. And so they're like, oh, okay, I'll buy that. We have Mr. Blue going on, and here's the thing about Mr. Blue. Like, Mr. Brown and Mr. Blue are probably the most, like, they're not even in this film. Like, Mr. Blue really isn't in this film. I don't even remember what really actually happens with his character, but he's just like gone. Like it feels like he ran like a million miles away, and we never see him through the rest of this film. I think that they might have mentioned what happened to him at some point, but like, uh, but anyways, so. But Mr. Brown goes on, and he, of course, I'll talk about how he, uh, like, I'll mention now. Mr. Brown is to die in this film. He ends up getting shot in the head, and he ends up having, like, blood just pouring all over his face to where he goes blind because there's just blood all over his face. And we have it at some point where Mr. Brown is kind of in the car with Orange and White, and he just kind of dies in the car, and both Orange and White are trying to run off to find some other car, and are going on and finding a woman that is to, of course, shoot Mr. Orange in the chest. Hence, why we kind of see what we see in the very beginning of this movie. So let's back up a little bit. So we have the guys going on and talking about music and going on and on and on about music. And so all of a sudden we have, of course, Joe, who's trying to think of this name. He's going on and on about this name. This like Toby something. It's like Jackie Chan. So like we have this guy just kind of rattling through these names and trying to figure out what the heck that this guy's name is, to the point where Mr. White just gets furious with him. And he's like, you know what? I'm going to take this book away from you for us to just kind of finish this meal, because these guys are going on and talking about Madonna music in one part of my ear, and you're going on and talking about this one guy over and over and over again in my other. Like there's just too much dialogue going on between all of you combined together, and Mr. White is just miserable to the point that Mr. White is going to keep his book until they finish their meal. So all of a sudden, people start pitching in to tip this waitress, and all of a sudden, Mr. Pink doesn't pitch in. And so they go on and on and on about Mr. Pink not pitching in for this tip. And so Mr. Pink is justifyingly just like, well, hey, like, if this girl doesn't get paid enough, then she should quit. Like, why does she always have to rely on tips and whatever? And these guys go on and they're like, well, hey, like, this waitress, like, she doesn't make really any money. Like, she makes garbage for money, and so she depends on this money. And so Pink is just like, yeah, I never tip. Like, maybe every once in a blue moon, if somebody's doing, like, out of their way service, then he'll tip them. But he just never does it. And so finally, after this huge dialogue about like tipping and everything like that, we have Joe, who comes back and realizes that Mr. Pink didn't put his dollar in. And so Joe is just like, well, hey, you cheapskate, like, freaking give me your dollar for the tip for this girl. And we have Mr. Pink that's just like, well, since you're the one who paid for my meal, like, I will give my tip to you. And so at least he'll do that. Because they remark about how, like, cheap that he is. And, like, really, to me, if I was Mr. Pink, then I would have just gone and, like, gotten fast food, because he kind of mentions that you never tip the kid at McDonald's for giving you, like, your burger. Like, you never do that. And so, like, there's a lot of sense there. There's a lot of interesting dialogue coming out of the beginning of this film for me. So now let's go on. So we, of course, in the very beginning of this film, we, of course, have Mr. Orange, who is bloodshot, or shot in the chest, and there's blood pouring out of his chest. And so Orange is like going, I'm dying, in this kind of weird registry of talking. Like, it's very high-end talking, where it's like, I'm dying. I'm just like, man, that's a little high up there. And so Mr. Orange is like saying, I'm dying, and he's in the back seat, and Mr. White's kind of like holding his hand. He's like, are you a doctor? Like, are you a doctor? Are you a registered doctor? And Mr. Orange is like, well, no, I'm not a doctor. And so Mr. White's like, so yes, you're not going to die here, because you don't know whether you can be dead or not. So, like, tell me you're going to be okay. And so the guy says nothing, and Mr. White's like, tell me. And so Mr. Orange is like, I'm going to be okay. It's like, I thought so. So both Mr. White and Mr. Orange go on to this hideout that they were supposed to meet after this heist was over. And so all of a sudden Mr. Pink arrives, and is kind of going on of like, oh my god, like what happened to you guys? What happened to everybody? And like Mr. Pink was kind of lucky to get out of there when he could, and he had the diamonds and he kind of stashed them away because he was kind of worried that if he was to come back to this place, he was gonna get freaking cuffed, and so we have kind of Mr. Pink kind of like conspiracy theorist here, and he's telling Mr. White, it's like, hey, like there's got to be somebody that's got to be a rat here that kind of pinched on us or whatever, or talked, like told all these cops what was going on, because there was an absurd number of cops that are all making their way to this jewelry store, and so like something seemed unusual about all this, and we got to figure out who the rat is, and so we have kind of Pink rattling around thinking that possibly anybody could really be the rat here, even to the point where like he blames that like even Mr. White, who he's talking to, could be the rat also. And Mr. White is turning to Mr. Pink. It's like, well, hey, like you could be the rat. And Mr. Pink's like, now you're thinking, like now you're talking, like don't trust anybody right now until this whole thing is done and settled with. So we have the backstory of Mr. White, who is to have us find out that Mr. White is to like be good friends with Joe, and Mr. White, of course, who is kind of Larry in these early scenes, and Mr. White is to almost tell Mr. Pink what his real name is, and Mr. Pink is like, I don't want to know, like, I don't want to know who you are. And I guess Larry had gone on at some point and told Mr. Orange who he was, technically his first name, and some kind of stuff about him. So Larry is talking to Joe, and so Joe is kind of laying down the whole plan that they're going to knock off this jeweler's on this special day, because they're having these certain kind of diamonds that are coming in that are supposed to be taken to Vermont, and Larry is telling Joe, it's like, well, no, they won't, because we're going to take them. And so kind of Joe is giving Larry the lay of the land of like how this is going to like be planned out and go down, and so on and so forth. Kind of showcasing that Larry does have some like previous connection with Joe, and so this isn't like just all like a random like meeting between people. So we have Mr. White and Mr. Pink that are just trying to think about what they're going to do with Mr. Orange, because Mr. Orange had begged Mr. White at some point, like, hey man, like take me to the hospital, like somebody may not come, like, and I might bleed out, so like take me to the hospital, I won't tell anybody about anything, just kind of take me to the hospital and get me out of here. So we have Mr. White talking to Mr. Pink as like Orange is just kind of passed out from all the blood loss. And so Mr. White is talking to Mr. Pink and saying like, well, yeah, maybe we should get him to a hospital. And Mr. Pink is like, well, yeah, maybe we should get out of here. Like, because it feels just kind of weird that Joe isn't already here waiting for us. And it just seems so weird. And Mr. Pink is even thinking that Joe might be the rat. And Mr. White's like, why would he have put on this job to just like step out on us? This seems weird. Like, I don't think so. So we really have them both kind of talking about like whether or not to get Mr. Orange to the hospital, because it's the right thing to do, and this guy might eventually bleed out if they wait here any longer. all of a sudden, Mr. Blonde is to show up. Of course, Mr. Blonde is to talk to the other guys, and Mr. White is having a lot of stuff to say, and because Mr. White is kind of telling Mr. Blonde how he's just kind of like a wild man or a psychopath or whatever, and Mr. Blonde is like, "You done talking, little doggy? Like, you done? Like, are you gonna bite me or like what? Like, come on." To the point where Mr. Blonde just wants to fight. Like, Mr. Blonde just doesn't give a crap. And we find out Mr. Blonde's kind of backstory. So we find out Mr. Blonde had worked with Joe before and had gone to jail and had spent 4 years in jail where he could have probably ratted out Joe and he didn't. And so Mr. Blonde had gone on and told Joe, it's like, well, hey man, like thanks for all the stuff that you kept sending me during prison. Like I really do appreciate it. And Joe was like, well, hey, I wish I could have sent a lot more. So we have Mr. Blonde going and talking, or Vic Vegas, going and talking to Nice Guy Eddie. And so Nice Guy Eddie is going on and talking about that, like he was probably either Vic was to either get like a freaking like a man in prison, or that Vic was to get like rammed by a bunch of men at prison, and so on and so forth. And so we have this like weird prison kind of joking dialogue, and so we go on and we have Vic, who's to kind of hear about this new thing going on here, and so he agrees to it. So now we have now Mr. Blonde, who is talking to White and Pink, and he's telling them like, "Hey guys, like I got something for you both." So he goes out to his car, and in the trunk is to be this police officer. And they're kind of like, ha 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 ha. So they grab this police officer and they start beating the crap out of him. They start punching into him. And so they're just punching the crap out of this guy. And so they're now wanting to know who possibly is the rat out of this group. So cue up us going on and having Mr. Orange's backstory, where we find out that Mr. Orange is to be this police officer, Freddy, and he is to be going undercover, and he is talking to this guy, who I guess is another undercover officer, that is kind of telling him the only way that Freddy's going to win over these guys is to go on and have this kind of big, massive story, kind of talking about his past. And so this guy has to memorize it, say it over and over and over and over again, and know every single detail about this whole story, to the point where if Mr. Orange is going to go into the bathroom, know every single thing about this bathroom. Like, know if the bathroom stinked, know if like the bathroom was stained, or if the stalls were open, if they weren't open, like who was in the bathroom at the time that you were trying to go on and take a pee. Like you need to know every single like detail, like the back of your hand, when telling these people this story. And so Mr. Orange is going on and on and on and on, memorizing this story, to the point where Mr. Orange finally goes on and is to meet up with Joe and Nice Guy Eddie. And so he tells them this whole story, going on and telling him at one point that he was to have quite a bit of drugs on him, and he ended up going into this bathroom with a number of police officers and a drug dog right there in the bathroom. And all of a sudden, these guys are going on about a story about a guy that they had arrested while Mr. Orange is just kind of taking the leak and then getting the heck out of there. So, and they are kind of so won over by this story. They're like, "Hey, well, we have a job going on. Like, are you interested?" So, after such a long stretch of time, kind of happens here. Uh, they end up going on and calling Nice Guy Eddie, and Nice Guy Eddie goes and comes there and is to complain to them about, like, man, there's too many cars parked out here. Like, this looks really suspicious. Like, you guys need to start getting rid of some of these cars because this looks way too suspicious. And so they start, like, both Mr. White and Mr. Orange or Mr. White and Mr. Pink start getting some cars. Nice Guy Eddie goes to leave, and so Mr. Blonde has his cop with him, and so we have it where Mr. Blonde is to like a certain radio station, and he starts singing this one song, and he's like getting so jazzed as he has this like blade out, and he's like, "Joker's to the right, here I am, stuck in the middle of you." And so all of a sudden we have Mr. Blonde going through and like blading up this officer and like cutting off this guy's ear, and he's just kind of like slowly but surely pouring gasoline all over this cop to torch him, and Mr. Orange goes on and shoots him and kills him. So we of course have Mr. Orange that tells the cop that he is a cop, and the cop, who is Marvin, is talking to Mr. Orange and saying like, "Yeah, like I met you some months ago." And Mr. Orange is like, "Really? Like I don't remember that at all." And he's like, "Yeah, like I remember you're a cop." So he's like, "Oh, okay." So Mr. Orange is just saying like all they need to do is just wait for this one guy to come in here. So all we need to do is just bleed out, or all we need to do is just bleed here and just kind of wait for this guy to arrive. So really, I could have gone on and talked about like the whole Mr. Brown story, but I think I've already said that, what happened to him, the aftermath of that, so I don't need to really go through that, luckily for me. So, luckily I said it because I knew that it was going to come up at some point. So, I'm just trying to think here if there's anything that I probably had forgotten at this point, as far as little kind of backstories of little things. So, Mr. Blonde, I believe, is to also tell us the aftermath of what happens to Mr. Blue, because both White and Pink didn't know what happened to Blue, but of course they were there. They knew what happened to Brown. So, like, I think Blue just kind of booked it. Like, he just left. He just scrambled out. And, like, you never see him again. So, we now have Nice Guy Eddie, who ends up coming back, and then slowly but surely, like, Joe comes in there. And so, Nice Guy Eddie is just kind of frustrated with of course, Mr. Orange. And we kind of reflect on this one story that Nice Guy Eddie was to have, going on and talking about this one girl and trying to compare her to some star on some TV show. And all the guys are just like, wait a minute, like this girl on that show, wait, that's not right. Like, and they try to figure out like the girl that was on that show. And so Eddie's just like, well, anyways, like, she looked just like this girl. And so they're trying to like poke so many holes in this guy's story, or they're trying to go on and just kind of figure out a way to just annoy this guy. And so like they have these little like bits of dialogue, which I'm like, man, like this like kind of dialogue is so confusing because it's so little bits and little parts. But you would probably think even at some points also, if somebody might have been in the back of the car, we might have had some maybe cheat sheets somewhere. Because I know I probably would. I'd be like duct taping certain lines of dialogue uh, on like back of car seats or something where people can't actually see, or kind of just glove compartments or whatever. Uh, because like yeah, why not? So, but yeah, like we had that whole Eddie story where he continues to go on and on about this woman. So, and I didn't get to any of it, but I just figured I'd mention that just to kind of cover the bases of that. So Eddie goes on and he comes back, and we now have it where Mr. Orange is telling this story that Mr. Blonde was going to leave them and kill everybody and run away with the money and run away with these diamonds. And we also had Mr. White's story, Larry, and he was talking about like them moving these diamonds, and he was like man, like I don't really know much of anybody anymore who does who moves diamonds. And Joe was like, well, yeah, you know that guy from before, he moved diamonds, and Larry was just like, well, like he's serving a couple years in time, so like he won't be able to move any diamonds, so it's good that you know somebody. So Mr. Blonde is of course dead, and so Eddie is just like, I don't believe Mr. Orange's story because this guy just spent 4 years in prison, and like he could have like snitched on Joe and he didn't. And you're telling me this guy spent 4 years in prison just to turn around on this one heist, steal all these diamonds to run off? Like this makes no sense to me. And so everybody's starting to get suspicions that Mr. Orange is the cop, is the rat. And Joe comes in here and he's all ticked and he's like thinking, yeah, like the only person that I like did 100% trust was Mr. Orange. So yeah, I'm just going to I'm going to put an end to this right now. So after Eddie is to go on and shoot this cop, Eddie, Mr. White, and Joe all whip out their guns and they're just kind of pointing them at one another. And so Mr. White is telling Joe, it's like, well, hey, if you put a bullet in this guy, I'm going to put a bullet in you. And so they go on and they shoot one another. And then so Mr. White and Mr. Orange are now kind of both shot. And Mr. Pink is kind of like underneath this place, just kind of keeping it easy. He's just like, God, I'm gonna get freaking shot. And so finally, we have it where, of course, Mr. Orange is telling Mr. White that he's a cop and he's sorry. And we have Mr. White that is holding a gun to this guy. And we had both Mr. White and Mr. Pink who went on to go and get the diamonds from Mr. Pink's hiding spot to bring them back here before when they left. And so all of a sudden the cops are coming in. They're telling everybody freeze. They're going to arrest everybody. And so now Mr. White has like this gun on Mr. Orange, thinking about pulling the trigger. And because Mr. White is thinking like, well, I guess we're going to go on and do some time. And Mr. Orange is like, well, I'm a cop. So Mr. White's like, fuck. So, yeah. So that's just the way this movie is to play out. That's amazing that I was able to just cover all this movie in 34 some odd minutes. I thought it would have been a lot longer than that. But with that said, plus again, this movie's very dialogue heavy, and so really like that's kind of like the easiest thing about this is because I'm normally not a person that talks about a lot of the dialogue in a story. So with that said, I think I'm going to go on and call it a day and go on to review other things. So, bye, buddy. Bye, buddy.